At the state level, reform governors battled corporate interests and championed such measures as the initiative, the referendum, and the direct primary to give common people control of their own government. In New York, Charles Evans Hughes battled fraudulent insurance companies. In California, Hiram Johnson successfully fought against the economic and political power of the Southern Pacific Railroad. In Wisconsin, Robert La Follette established a strong personal following as the governor who won passage of the Wisconsin Idea, a series of progressive measures that included a direct primary law, tax reform, and state regulatory commissions to monitor railroads, utilities, and business such as insurance. Whether or not to shut down saloons and prohibit the drinking of alcohol was one issue over which the champions of reform were sharply divided. While urban progressives recognized that saloons were often the neighborhood headquarters of political machines, they generally had little sympathy for the temperance movement. Rural reformers, on the other hand, thought they could clean up morals and politics in one stroke by abolishing liquor. The Dries, or the Prohibitionists, were determined and well organized. By 1915, they had persuaded the legislatures of 2/3 of the states to prohibit the sale of alcoholic beverages. Urban life in the progressive era was improved not only by political reformers, but also by the efforts of the settlement house workers and other civic-minded volunteers. Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, and other leaders of the social justice movement found that they needed political support in the state legislatures for meeting the needs of immigrants and the working class. They lobbied vigorously and with considerable success for better schools, juvenile courts, liberalized divorce laws, and safety regulations for tenements and factories. Believing that criminals could learn to become effective citizens, reformers fought for such measures as a system of parole, separate reformatories for juveniles, and limits on the death penalty. Progressives were most outraged by the treatment of children by industry. The National Child Labor Committee proposed model state child labor laws that were passed by 2/3 of the states by 1907. Ultimately, state compulsory school attendance laws proved most effective in keeping children out of the mines and factories. Florence Kelley and the National Consumers League promoted the passage of state laws to protect women from long working hours. In Muller versus Oregon, the High Court ruled that the health of women needed special protection from long hours. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911 in New York City's high-rise garment factory took 146 lives, most of which were women. That tragedy sparked greater women's activism and motivated states to pass laws to improve safety and working conditions in factories. One unforeseen consequence of efforts to protect women in the workplace was that the legislation kept women out of physically demanding but higher-paying jobs in industry and mining. Later, many in the women's movement wanted these restrictions lifted so that women could compete as equals with men. While progressive governors and mayors were battling conservative forces in the state houses and city halls, 3 presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, sought broad reforms and regulations at the national level. Following President McKinley's assassination in September of 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became at the age of 42 the youngest president in U.S. history. He was also one of the most athletic. He was unusual not simply because of his age and vigor, but also because he believed that the president should do much more than lead the executive departments. He thought it was the president's job to set the legislative agenda for Congress as well. So, by the accident of McKinley's death, the progressive movement suddenly shot into high gear under that dynamic leadership. Presidents in the 19th century had consistently taken the side of owners in conflicts with labor, most notably Hayes in the railroad strike of 1877 and Cleveland in the Pullman strike of 1894. However, in the first economic crisis of his presidency, Roosevelt quickly demonstrated that he favored neither business nor labor, but insisted on a square deal for both. The crisis involved a strike of anthracite coal miners through much of 1902. If the strike continued, many Americans feared that without coal, they would freeze to death when winter came. Roosevelt took the unusual step of trying to mediate the labor dispute by calling a union leader and coal mine workers to the White House. The mine owners' stubborn refusal to compromise angered the president. To ensure the delivery of coal to consumers, he threatened to take over the mines with federal troops. The owners finally agreed to accept the findings of a special commission, which granted a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday to the miners. However, the owners did not have to recognize the union. Voters seemed to approve of Roosevelt and his square deal. They elected him by a landslide in 1904. Roosevelt further increased his popularity by being the first president since the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to enforce that poorly written law. The trust that he most wanted to bust was a combination of railroads known as the Northern Securities Company. Reversing its position in earlier cases, the Supreme Court in 1904 upheld Roosevelt's action in breaking up the railroad monopoly. Roosevelt later directed his attorney general to take antitrust action against Standard Oil and more than 40 other large corporations. Roosevelt did make a distinction between breaking up bad trusts, which harmed the public and stifled competition, and regulating good trusts, which through efficiency and low prices dominated a market. President Roosevelt also took the initiative in persuading a Republican majority in Congress to pass 2 laws that significantly strengthened the regulatory powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Under the Elkins Act of 1903, the Interstate Commerce Commission had greater authority to stop railroads from granting rebates to favored customers. Under the Hepburn Act of 1906, the Commission could fix just and reasonable rates for railroads. As a lover of the wilderness and the outdoor life, Roosevelt enthusiastically championed the cause of conservation. In fact, Roosevelt's most original and lasting contribution in domestic policy may have been his efforts to protect the natural resources of the nation. These 3 actions that he made were particularly important. One was the use of the Forest Reserve Act in 1891. Roosevelt set aside 158 million acres of federal land as a national reserve. In 1902, Roosevelt also won passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act. This law provided money for the sale of public land for irrigation projects in the West. And then in 1908, the president publicized the need for conservation by hosting a White House Conference of Governors to promote coordinated conservation, planning ideas, projects. He created the National Conservation Commission, and it was under the leadership of a guy named Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania. Roosevelt earlier appointed Pinchot to be the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. The good-natured William Howard Taft had served in Roosevelt's cabinet as Secretary of War. Honoring the 2-term tradition, Roosevelt refused to seek re-election and picked Taft to be his successor. The Republican Party readily endorsed Taft as its nominee for president in 1908, and as expected, defeated for a 3rd time the Democrats' campaigner William Jennings Bryan. Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies. As a trust buster, Taft ordered the prosecution of almost twice the number of antitrust cases as his predecessor. Among these cases was one against U.S. Steel, which included a merger approved by then-President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt became angry and viewed Taft's action as a personal attack on his integrity. As a conservationist, Taft established the Bureau of Mines. He also added large tracts to the Appalachians, to the National Forest Reserves, and he set aside federal oil lands. He was the first president to do that. 2 other progressive measures were at least equal in importance to legislation enacted under Roosevelt. The Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to suspend new railroad rates and oversee telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. The 16th Amendment, which was ratified by the states in 1913, authorized the U.S. government to collect an income tax. This reform was originally proposed by the Populists, remember, in their 1892 platform. Progressives in the Republican Party were unimpressed with Taft's achievements. In fact, they became so disenchanted with his leadership that they accused him of betraying their cause and joining the conservative wing of the party. They had several reasons for this. One was the Payne-Aldrich tariff. During his 1908 campaign, Taft had promised to lower the tariff. Instead, conservative Republicans in Congress passed the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909, which raised the tariff on most imports. Taft really angered progressives in his party not only by signing the tariff bill, but by making a public statement in its defense. The progressives respected the chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, as a dedicated conservationist. On the other hand, they distrusted Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, especially when he opened lands in Alaska for private development. So in 1910, when Pinchot criticized Ballinger, Taft stood by his cabinet member and fired Pinchot for insubordination. Conservatives applauded, progressives protested. Taft angered progressive Republicans when he failed to support their effort to reduce the dictatorial powers of Congress's leading conservative, Speaker of the House Joseph Cannon. And then fighting back against his progressive critics, Taft openly supported conservative candidates for Congress in the midterm elections of 1910. It was a serious political mistake. Progressive Republicans from the Midwest easily defeated the candidates endorsed by Taft. After this election, the Republican Party was split wide open between two opposing groups, a conservative faction loyal to Taft and a progressive faction. The latter group of Republicans fervently hoped that their ex-president and hero, Theodore Roosevelt, would agree to become their candidate again in 1912. A third party developed in the first decade of the 1900s that was dedicated to the welfare of the working class. Originally called the Socialist Labor Party, in 1897 it changed its name in 1901 to the Socialist Party of America. The Socialist platform called for more radical reforms than the progressives. They called for public ownership of the railroads, utilities, and even of major industries such as oil and steel. One of the Socialist Party's founders, Eugene Debs, was the party's candidate for president in 5 elections from 1900 to 1920. He was a former railway union leader, and Debs adopted socialism. He was jailed for the Pullman strike. He was an outspoken critic of business and a champion of labor. On such issues as workers' compensation and minimum wage laws, progressive and some socialists joined forces. For the most part, however, progressives wanted to distance themselves from the ideas of socialists, especially since the majority of voters favored only mild reforms, not radical causes. Eventually, some socialist ideas were accepted, like public ownership of utilities, the 8-hour work week, 8-hour work day, wouldn't that be nice? And then pensions for employees. Reform efforts dominated the 1912 campaign. President Taft was renominated by the Republicans after his supporters excluded Theodore Roosevelt's delegates from the party's convention. Progressive Republicans then formed a new party and nominated Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's claim was that he was as strong as a bull moose, and gave the new Progressive Party its nickname, the Bull Moose Party. After lengthy balloting, Democrats united behind Woodrow Wilson, a newcomer who had first been elected to office in 1910 as governor of New Jersey. The Socialist Party, at the peak of its strength, again nominated Eugene V. Debs. With Taft enjoying little popularity and Debs considered too radical, the election came down to a battle between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt called for a new nationalism, with more government regulation of business and unions, women's suffrage, more social welfare programs. Wilson pledged a new freedom, which would limit both big business and big government, bring about reform by ending corruption, and revive competition by supporting small business. Wilson won less than a majority of the popular vote, but with the Republicans split, he won a landslide in the Electoral College, and the Democrats gained control of Congress. The overwhelming support for the Progressive